Hello my dears, my name is Mariana and welcome to my channel. I know, it's been a really long time. As I get a little older, I just care a lot less about timelines. So I can't promise you when my videos are going to come out, unfortunately, but they're going to come out at some point, so just have faith. But I went on my Instagram recently and asked people what they would like for me to discuss in my next video, and interestingly, hands down, it was court cards. And I guess it's not so surprising because court cards are miserable. They're killer. It's just the truth. Every beginner tarot reader just absolutely is terrified of pulling them, and they can be really confusing, especially when there's random court cards that don't seem to have anything to do with the actual people in our lives. We'll pull like the King of Swords and say, well, I guess that's kind of reminds me of my dad, but this reading is about fixing this awkwardness in my friendship. Or we might pull the Page of Pentacles and say, okay, I'm a student, that card makes sense, but this reading is about how to find love. Traditionally, we read court cards as either a person in our life or a role we play in life. And it can just feel so limiting and just doesn't fit so much at the time. So what I want to offer you today is the method I have developed to really deepen the way we read court cards. The ways that I work with court cards are so rich and so useful and have absolutely transformed my relationship with them. When I pull them, they don't scare me anymore, and that is saying something because they scared me for a really long time. So there's really two ways that I work with court cards. One is the development of our cognitive functions. Thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation. And I have a whole video about how the cognitive functions work with the tarot and the 4 tarot suits, and that video is here, so go check it out. But more often, I actually read the court cards as representing our complexes. And this can be a little tricky territory, but if we can really kind of use this way of viewing the court cards to explore ourselves deeply, it is so incredible and so illuminating. So both these techniques are ones that I talk a lot about in the Archetypal Tarot school. And actually, it is currently open, and that is so exciting. If you haven't heard of the school before, it is my signature offering that puts my entire heart and soul and years of learning the tarot into this class. This is a 9-week program that is deep and intensive and extremely exciting. We bring all of the aspects of tarot reading into the depth psychological and archetypal lens. We move through reversals, court cards, the minor arcana, and of course the major arcana as the archetypal development of our individuation. This is for any aspiring tarotist with a growing knowledge of the cards and a real commitment to learning the depth of them. So the school's open. It's open for a limited time. It's already filling up really fast, so I highly recommend, if this is interesting to you, go click the link in the description and get more information. And after watching this video, if you're extremely stimulated and want to know more, that's where you learn more. But we're going to move through an abridged introduction to these techniques today, so let's get into it. So we're really going to focus on court cards and complexes today because we can really dig in there. And before we get into the technique I developed, we have to understand what complexes are. This is a bit overwhelming. Complexes are complex. It's a very sensitive part of depth psychology that we really have to be careful in how we talk about. We all have heard of the idea of a complex. We know many of the Freudian complexes out there, such as the Oedipal complex or the Medea complex. We think of complexes as things that are true for all of humankind and that we can all kind of fall into this weird psychological black hole. And that is true to an extent, but complexes are absolutely universal. We all carry complexes. They can be kind of small and personal, or they could be huge and archetypal. But when we talk about complexes through the Jungian lens, we're really talking about pieces of our personality. Jung identifies complexes as psychic entities that have escaped from control of consciousness and split off from it to lead a separate existence in the dark sphere of the psyche, whence they may at any time hinder or help the conscious performance. So basically, complexes are a part of our personality that is acting separately from our ego self, from the main identity, the I of our personality. So we have two simultaneous experiences of ourselves happening at once. So let's take the example of the very classic inferiority complex. One part of us, maybe the ego part of us, knows I am capable, I can get this work done, there's nothing really stopping me. But the complex, that inferiority complex, has another viewpoint. It's probably saying things like, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, nobody is going to value what I do. And so now we have a crisis. One part of ourselves is saying, I know I can get it done, we have to do it. And the other part is saying, I am terrified of it, it's going to confirm that I'm a failure. And so we get stuck. And while the inferiority complex is something that most of us know, complexes can look like anything. They show up often in our relationships, in how we show up in our professional lives. And so our goal with working with complexes is to recognize them, is to see them. And this is where the tarot comes in and the court cards, and we can really start the work. Maybe the King of Pentacles points to a complex around money and mastery, and maybe the Page of Cups points to a complex around our idealism or our kind of immaturity around our emotions. By putting these faces to the complex, giving them kind of these archetypal energies that the tarot already provides, we can understand them and we can integrate them. And before we go any further, I want to make a note that this, as I said, it's sticky work. We are not trying to psychoanalyze ourselves. I've been in Jungian analysis for at least 10 years, and most of this work around complexes I do in that container with somebody who can witness me and support me. But that doesn't mean we can't begin it on our own, and it doesn't mean that we can't get a lot of clarity by doing this work in our own way, slowly, consciously, and with the guidance of the cards. So don't assume that understanding our complexes through the lens of court cards is going to solve your life. It won't. The tarot never solves our life. Just ever. That's just a true thing. But what it can do is bring consciousness. And when we have consciousness, then we are not in the dark anymore. That's the point. So now let's get into 3 steps that I can offer to start working with the court cards and our complexes. Now, as I mentioned, this is a sort of truncated, abridged version of what I walk my students through in the Archetypal Tarot School. So again, if you're interested in that, if this feels deep to you, make sure to check out the school. But this should be enough to at least get you started. And to make it a little bit more practical, we're actually going to use the Knight of Cups. I probably should have had my deck out, shouldn't I? I assume everybody knows exactly what they're doing. Let's find the Knight of Cups. They're absolutely never where you want them to be, are they? Now this is just teasing me. This is just ridiculous. The Knight of Cups. So first, obviously, you need to pull a court card. Maybe you do this in a reading and there's just a court card that sticks out to you, or maybe when you pull one in your daily, weekly pull, maybe that's when you know this is a time to work with this card. But using the example of the Knight of Cups, the first thing we're going to do is notice what parts of you feel Knight of Cupsy. Now, maybe you don't have the tarot completely memorized yet, that's okay. You can totally use your guidebook and look up the things that we can associate with the Knight of Cups. But you can also just use your intuition. What feels like it connects to this card? So maybe after pondering it a while, you realize, well, I do sometimes get really emotional at work. Or maybe you realize you have a tendency to wonder if you're going to fall in love with everyone you meet. The work of really differentiating what belongs to the Knight of Cups versus what belongs to you. In this step, we are just trying to identify the complex. This alone can take a long time. We have to go slow and we have to be curious. Sometimes it can take days, weeks, months, or years to really identify the energies around a complex. And maybe you pull the Knight of Cups and you think nothing really connects with it. That's okay too. You don't have to force it. If it feels like it's not really there yet, then just let it be. Be flexible. Don't always assume you have some terrible complex you need to unearth. Just see if there is something there. That is the first step. Step 2, name the complex. Now, this is a really essential point in our work with the court cards and the complexes. Now that you're beginning to see a pattern, it's really important to give the complex, that other side of the personality, a name to really separate you from it. The point of this is to start building conscious relationship to it. So maybe you call it the Knight of Cups, or maybe you call it the Wounded Hero Complex, or maybe you call it Sensitive Steve. Whatever you want, it's your thing. But this is a really, really crucial point. And this is, I think, a place where people kind of freeze a lot. They might say, yeah, this Knight of Cups part of me maybe does get moody sometimes, but is that really something different from my experience of myself? And I think the thing to do is to kind of go back to step one and notice when these things come in. Do you feel moody when you have a trigger, when there is something that suddenly flips you into a different experience of yourself? So I want to give a little bit of an example of this because sometimes talking about complexes can be so abstract, and I want to make it real. So a long time ago when I first started my analysis, I had a real tendency to kind of get really triggered, get really anxious when certain things would happen. And the anxiety was normal, that wasn't surprising, but what was challenging about it is how rigid I would become. So rather than being nervous and going to my friends or my partner and saying, I'm feeling really nervous right now, and just seeking validation for that, I would kind of go into this mode of saying, I am strong, nothing bothers me, I can face any obstacle. And it was so relentless and so exhausting. And it took me a long time to realize that this was not really the way I wanted to behave when I had these anxieties come up. It felt different from me somehow. It felt like it was a part of me that would just come over me. And so I started this work of naming that complex. So whenever this part of me would get triggered, would come up, I would say, oh, there she is. That's what that is. And just kind of creating this little bit of separation really helped me understand I have a different choice in the moment. I can maybe be vulnerable. Maybe that's my authentic feeling right now. So it's just important to give it a name, give it a little bit of space. And so if I were to maybe pull a core card for myself now around that complex, I probably would pull something like the Queen of Swords, because it would reflect that kind of intensity and that hyper-rationality that would come over me. So if you pull the Knight of Cups, you feel the thing it's connected to, give it a name, really make it different and separate from yourself so you can continue that inner work. Our last step for getting started with this work is to understand and begin to integrate. Now this is kind of smushing a lot of the steps together, but it's for brevity, and this is also the trickiest part of the process, obviously. There's going to be a lot of resistance when you start to really try to understand a complex. With the example of the Knight of Cups, maybe you have noticed the pattern is to get really whiny when you feel like your partner's not showing you enough affection. And then you can name it and notice that anytime you have that impulse, you say, oh, that's the Knight of Cups entering the room. But now we need to understand what the Knight of Cups is really afraid of. So then we begin the work of creating a dialogue with the complex, with the card. So it really is as simple as it sounds. Just start talking to the Knight of Cups. When you blurt out everything that feels wrong in your life to a friend and they just don't really seem to care, and that Knight of Cups gets so extremely wounded and pouty, you can name it, say, oh, this is the Knight of Cups talking right now, and that is a really great opportunity to start that conversation and ask, what's going on with you? What was really hurtful about this experience that you're trying to maybe push away? This is a really good space to do that kind of like active imagination work. And I've made a video about how to do active imagination with the tarot, and it's up here somewhere, so go click on that. But essentially, just talk to it. Just say, hey, Knight of Cups, why do you react like that? What makes you uncomfortable? What do you feel was really going on in that situation? What you'll probably uncover is maybe the Knight of Cups is really afraid of being unlovable. Maybe it's really afraid of being perceived as selfish. The more you talk to this complex, the more you'll uncover the reason it behaves the way it does. And again, this can take a long time. You might have to come back into conversation with it for months before you really get to the heart of it. And of course, I also want to be really careful and make sure that we understand that when we're talking about these really deep complexes, we have to maybe tread a little lightly sometimes. Sometimes these complexes are really born out of deep wounds, traumas that we experienced. And so we want to be really wary. If you feel like there is something very dark and very heavy emerging as you explore this complex, back off. This is the kind of work to do in container with someone who's trained to do this with you, with a psychoanalyst or with a therapist. So just really please keep that in mind. It was important for me in the beginning of my work that I didn't do this all alone, and I think that's true for many of us. That being said, we can still use it to at least start the work, to start the recognition of the difference between ourselves and the complex and the card. So the more you understand the complex, the more that you'll be able to integrate it, to forgive it, to understand why it's there. If you understand that the Knight of Cups comes up because it's so afraid of not being loved, then maybe you won't be so hard on yourself the next time you react to somebody with a bit of that, classic moody narcissism that the Knight of Cups is so good at. That doesn't mean you don't have to take responsibility for it. It just means you can understand it. And then you can bring it into yourself and be more conscious when you choose how to act. So this is just an overview of how to begin working with court cards as complexes, and also just how to make them more readable, how to make them deeper. The court cards don't always have to represent your ex. So try this out. Let me know how it goes. Leave me a comment, and I hope you enjoyed it. And make sure to check out the Archetypal Tarot School before it fills up. Of course, make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you follow me on Instagram, and I hope you have a beautiful, meaningful day. This is the first time in like 5 years I blow dried my hair, as it's getting really long. So I guess the question is, do I like it?